The note arrived disguised as concern. That was always how it started. Not a demand, not a command. A suggestion, carefully worded, professionally softened, framed as help. The studio executive leaned forward across the conference table. Fingers steepled, voice calm. We just want to make sure it lands with the widest possible audience. Anthony Hopkins listened without interrupting. He had heard variations of this sentence for decades. It usually meant one thing: change the thing that matters. The executive continued. Some of the edges feel severe. We're wondering if you might soften certain moments. Make the character a little more accessible. Hopkins didn't react. Another executive joined in, nodding. Nothing major. Just a few tonal adjustments. Less intensity. Intensity. That word again. Hopkins glanced down at the script in front of him. The margins were already filled with his handwriting. Small notes, arrows, reminders to listen rather than push. He'd chosen this project precisely because it didn't ask for softness. It asked for honesty. He looked back up. Which moments? He asked. The first executive smiled, relieved he hadn't pushed back immediately. Well, for example, this scene here. He tapped a page. The silence goes on a bit long. We thought maybe you could fill it with a line. Something that explains what he's feeling. Hopkins nodded slowly. And here, the second executive added, flipping pages. The confrontation feels unforgiving. Audiences like redemption. Hopkins folded his hands. There it was. Redemption. The insistence that every character must reassure the audience of their moral safety. That no one be allowed to remain unresolved. Hopkins had signed on to the film because it refused that impulse. He'd made that clear from the beginning. I thought we were aligned, Hopkins said quietly. We are, the first executive said quickly. This is just refinement. Hopkins smiled faintly. Refinement, he repeated. He leaned back in his chair. You're asking me to remove the discomfort, he said. The executives exchanged glances. We're asking you to guide it, one said. Audiences don't like being pushed too hard. Hopkins tilted his head. They don't like being underestimated either. Silence followed. The director, young, talented, sitting slightly apart, watched anxiously. This was his first major project. Studio backing meant everything. He didn't want conflict. He didn't want sides. He wanted the film made. Hopkins turned to him. Why did you write this scene the way you did? Hopkins asked gently. The director hesitated. Because it felt true. Hopkins nodded, then looked back at the executives. There it is, he said. Truth. One of them laughed politely. Truth is subjective. No, Hopkins replied. Taste is. Truth is uncomfortable. The meeting ended without resolution. That was the first note. More followed. Emails, calls, revisions suggested for clarity. Each one shaved at the same place. The quiet, the refusal to explain, the moral ambiguity. Hopkins responded less and less. Not out of petulance. Out of attention. He began to notice something else happening. The notes weren't about the film anymore. They were about control. The studio wasn't worried about the audience. They were worried about liability. About backlash. About critics misreading intent. About headlines that might make them uncomfortable. Hopkins had seen this pattern before. Studios didn't censor by erasing ideas outright. They diluted them, until nothing sharp enough remained to cut. During the third meeting, the tone shifted. We need to know you're willing to collaborate, an executive said, no longer smiling. Hopkins met his gaze. I am collaborating. You're resisting. No, Hopkins said. I am protecting. From what? From becoming harmless, Hopkins replied. The room went still. The director looked down at his hands. You have to understand, another executive said, more firmly now. This is a studio picture. Hopkins nodded. Then it should stand for something. That's not how business works, the executive snapped. Hopkins smiled faintly. That's how art does. The word art landed badly. Executives disliked it when actors used it as leverage. That was when the threat appeared. Subtle. Implied. We're investing a lot in this, one executive said. We expect flexibility. Hopkins understood perfectly. Flexibility meant compliance. He closed his notebook. "Let me ask you something," he said. The executive stiffened. "Why did you come to me for this role?" Hopkins asked. The first executive answered quickly. "Because of your reputation." "For what?" Hopkins pressed. A pause. "Gravitas," the executive said. "Authority. Depth." Hopkins nodded. "And you want that, without the discomfort that comes with it." No one spoke. "You can't order weight à la carte," Hopkins continued. "It comes attached to things you don't always like." The director finally looked up. "Tony." Hopkins raised a hand gently. "Let me finish." He turned back to the executives. "I won't soften this," he said. "I won't explain it. And I won't apologize for the silence." The lead executive leaned back. "Then we have a problem." Hopkins considered that. "Yes," he said. "We do." The meeting ended abruptly. That evening, Hopkins went home and reread the script again. Not for the first time. For the last. He imagined the film with the studio's changes. The added lines. The emotional hand-holding. The softened edges. It would be competent. And meaningless. He picked up the phone. Not to argue. Not to threaten. To decide. He called his agent. "They want to tone it down," Hopkins said simply. The agent sighed. "I figured. I won't." A pause. "That's going to complicate things." "Yes. They might pull the plug." Hopkins smiled faintly. "Or I might." The agent straightened. "Are you serious?" "Yes." Another pause, heavier this time. "You'd walk away?" Hopkins looked out the window. "I'd rather move it," he said. "Move it where?" Hopkins answered without hesitation. "Somewhere that doesn't need to be reassured." The agent exhaled slowly. "That's a big gamble." Hopkins nodded. "So is silence. So is honesty." The agent hesitated. "You know what this could cost." Hopkins smiled. "I know what it already has." That night, the director received a message. "Call me." They spoke for hours. Not about contracts. About intention. About what the film was actually saying, and whether they were willing to let it say it without translation. The director was terrified. But he was honest. "I don't want to lose it," he said. Hopkins replied quietly. "Then don't lose yourself first." The next morning, Hopkins made his move. He didn't announce it. Didn't posture. He simply informed the studio that he would no longer proceed under the current conditions. There was disbelief. Then anger. Then a flurry of calls. "Let's talk this through. Maybe we overstepped. We can compromise." Hopkins listened politely. Then declined. The director followed him. That decision sent shockwaves through the building. Projects don't just leave studios midstream. Especially not with the lead actor attached. But Hopkins wasn't bluffing. Within days, quiet conversations began elsewhere. Other studios. Other producers. People who understood exactly what was at stake, and why Hopkins' refusal wasn't arrogance. It was alignment. By the end of the week, the project had a new home. Same script. Same tone. Same silence. The original studio didn't announce the loss publicly. They didn't have to. Inside, consequences were already forming. Meetings were held behind closed doors. Questions were asked about judgment. About overreach. About how a project with that level of talent had slipped through their hands, and the executive who had pushed hardest for toning it down was suddenly very quiet. Because in Hollywood, there's one unforgivable mistake. Not losing money, losing credibility. And what happened next to that executive, to the film, and to Hopkins' reputation as someone who would not bend, would become a lesson whispered about long after the movie was released. That part of the story was only beginning. The fallout didn't happen all at once. It never does in Hollywood. Publicly, everything stayed polite. Statements were drafted, rewritten, softened. The studio framed the separation as a creative divergence. The press accepted it without digging too deeply. Projects changed hands all the time. That part wasn't unusual. What was unusual was how fast the silence spread inside the building. Meetings that had once been easy suddenly required explanation. Executives who'd nodded confidently during note sessions now found themselves being asked uncomfortable questions by people further up the ladder. How did this happen? Why wasn't this anticipated? Why did one actor manage to walk a film out the door? The answer no one wanted to say aloud was simple. Because the wrong person had pushed. The executive who'd insisted most aggressively on toning it down had believed he was protected by process, by precedent, by the assumption that talent would eventually yield to structure. That assumption failed. When the project resurfaced at a rival studio, unchanged and fully intact, it sent a message far louder than any press release could have. Anthony Hopkins hadn't left in a huff. He hadn't burned bridges. He had simply demonstrated that he was willing to take the long road to preserve the work. And that scared people. The rival studio didn't celebrate the acquisition. They handled it quietly, deliberately. No grand announcements. No victory laps. They understood exactly what they were inheriting, not just a film but a philosophy. The director was shaken but focused. "We do it the same way," he said during the first meeting. "Or we don't do it at all." The studio head nodded. "That's why we're here." Hopkins said very little. He didn't need to. The absence of new notes spoke volumes. Production resumed with a different energy. Not lighter, clearer. Scenes were allowed to run long. Silence was protected rather than trimmed. No one asked for explanatory lines anymore. Editors stopped suggesting fixes. They started listening. The director noticed it first. "You know," he said one evening after reviewing a cut, "this is the first time no one's asked me to justify a pause." Hopkins smiled faintly. "That's because justification kills instinct." The film took shape slowly. Not inefficiently, but intentionally. Everyone involved understood the risk now. There was no safety net of compromise left. If it failed, it would fail honestly. That knowledge sharpened the work. When the film finally screened internally, the response was not explosive. It was attentive. People sat forward. They didn't whisper. They didn't check their phones. The final scene ended without music. No one moved. That was the test. And it passed. Meanwhile, back at the original studio, consequences solidified. The executive who had pushed for censorship wasn't fired immediately. Hollywood rarely does things that cleanly. Instead, responsibilities shifted. Influence narrowed. Invitations stopped arriving. He was reassigned to development oversight. A polite way of saying he would no longer be trusted with projects that required instinct. Within 6 months he was gone. No announcement. No scandal. Just absence. People noticed. Quietly. The lesson traveled faster than the story itself. Don't underestimate conviction. Don't mistake silence for compliance. And never assume an actor like Anthony Hopkins is bluffing. When the film was released, critics struggled to categorize it. Some called it austere. Others called it uncompromising. A few admitted it made them uncomfortable. That discomfort became its power. Audiences didn't leave buzzing with quotable lines. They left quiet, thoughtful, divided in the best possible way. It didn't break records. It endured. Years later, the film would be referenced not for its box office performance, but for its restraint, for its refusal to explain itself, for trusting viewers enough to let them sit with ambiguity. And inevitably, the story of its making resurfaced. Not in headlines, in conversations. You know, someone would say, "That film almost didn't exist in that form. How come?" Studio wanted it softened. And they tried. Hopkins walked. That was usually where the story ended. No one needed the details. The fact that he'd done it at all was enough. Anthony Hopkins was asked about it once much later during a quiet interview. "Is it true you moved a film because the studio wanted changes?" the interviewer asked. Hopkins considered the question. "I didn't move it," he said. "I stayed with it." The interviewer blinked. "Stayed with what?" "The intention," Hopkins replied. "The film was never the problem." "Would you do it again?" the interviewer asked. Hopkins smiled faintly. "I do it every time." That was the real ending. Not the executive's departure. Not the rival studio's win. Not even the film's legacy. But the clarity of the principle behind it. Anthony Hopkins hadn't made a power move. He'd made a boundary. And by refusing to let his work be diluted for comfort, he reminded everyone watching, studios, directors, actors alike, that some stories lose